I also am an introvert, but you were surprised to learn that you're an introvert.
I just thought I didn't like talking to people. I was in college, and they had a group of us stand up and describe our perfect weekend, and mine was me watching Star Trek by myself with no one around, and that was kind of the tip-off.
Yeah. Is that what someone said to you, or did you all of a sudden put that together, or did someone say you're an introvert?
Oh, no, I was an example. I just didn't know I was a guinea pig. So they had 3 of us stand up in front of the class or a group of people, and they asked each one of us to describe our perfect weekend. I wasn't going to Rio. I wasn't going to a beach party. I was going to watch Star Trek. And she's like, extrovert, middle of the road, introvert.
Yeah. It's a good thing you found out. Now you know.
It was.
You know. Stacey has a new book out. It's called While Justice Sleeps. Congratulations. The reviews are fantastic. Tell everybody about, and it's a novel, so tell everybody what it's about.
So it's about a Supreme Court justice who is the swing vote on a very controversial case, and he falls into a coma. The person who has his power of attorney and the ability to decide whether he lives or dies is his lowly law clerk, Avery Keene, and she has a series of clues she has to unravel to not only save his life, but possibly save the country.
Fantastic idea. And you started working on this a decade ago, but then the publishers passed on it. Why would they pass on it then?
Well, it was agents who were telling me that they didn't think publishers would buy a book about a far-fetched president who was involved in international intrigue and scandal that was bombastic, and they thought that no one really cared about the Supreme Court because it wasn't really relevant to American lives.
I see. Wow. Very. Yeah. Have you talked to them since then? Have you? Oh my God. And then I was just asking during the break if this was your first novel, and they said you'd written a bunch of romance novels under a different name.
Yes, I've written 8 romance novels as Selena Montgomery. I wrote under a pen name because I was also publishing articles on the operational dissonance of the unrelated business income tax. And I thought no one wanted to read a romance novel by Alan Greenspan, so I kept the identity secret.
That's incredible. That's incredible. So the book is fiction, but there's a lot about politics, so I assume you pulled from real life experiences, right?
I did.
Yeah. And do these people know who they are in the book?
There are a few people. I like to use the names of friends, and I warn them that, if you're in my book, you are at my disposal, and so I have a friend who's the current Speaker of the House here in Georgia. We do not agree politically. I hope I don't get him in trouble because he was in the book when I started writing it a decade ago, and I kept him in. And then I have another friend who was a little put out by her role in the book. It wasn't quite as meaty as she hoped, but I'm like, you're not dead. So that's a thing.
You didn't kill her off. Yeah, she could be, because now she could be in the TV series, because now the book is they're making it into a TV series. Will you be in it at all?
Oh, dear God, no.
No. Just like a Hitchcock moment where you just see you in the background where you're, he used to be in everything.
I could pull a Hitchcock / Stan Lee and just kind of appear, but it's going to be really fast, and I'm out of there.
I think that would be great, though. Like, we look for each episode where you find Stacey, like just in the background or, like as an extra. I think it would be a really fun thing for people to look for you.
I will give that. I'll give that note to the producers.
What was your overall thoughts about this book? Your overall impressions about this book? Like, how do you feel about it?
I enjoyed the book, but for me, it was a lot of information and it was a lot of twists and turns. So it was kind of hard for me listening to follow along because it was just like this person, India, it was just, everything was just getting uncovered. It's like one of those nonstop uncovering kind of books. So I would be into it and I would get lost a little bit when it got a little too into detail, because Stacey Abrams is a great writer, but she's very detailed and she uses an extensive vocabulary. So that was another thing on top of that, because I was like I know I'm an avid reader, but I was like, I need to look up some of these words she's using.
Well, I hated the book. I'm just playing.
Look, you hold nothing back, huh?
I actually did like the book. The book actually holds your attention, from the very beginning to the end. And like Kim said, I had to go back and reread some chapters because I actually read the book because I missed a lot of the clues in the later part of the book. Like she was really detailed. It was like a lot of twists and turns, and it was a good read, but it was just hard to follow along because there's just so much happening within that book. And unlike many books that I have read, this one just throws you right into overdrive as soon as you actually start reading it. It's no slow build up at all. And it really wasn't like any unnecessary character development. She just goes right in. Stacey Abrams just throws you into this corrupt political world, and you feel immersed in all this complex action and these character responses. And although I did not know what to expect when I purchased this book, but after reading like the first few chapters, I actually did kind of like the book, and I got kind of thrilled about going to the next chapter. And for me, even if I really didn't want Stacey, I know Stacey Abrams, she's running for, governor for Georgia, but if she wasn't running for governor, I would be itching, to actually read this novel. That's how really good it was to me.
So it was very thorough. Yes. She was very detailed, which you have to think about authors and how we are and how we communicate. And I believe she communicated in this book the way she actually speaks. I enjoyed the book. I think she's an awesome writer. And she's got a gold star for me because I had no clue that she was so gifted and a creator like that. So, yeah.
As well, I had no clue that Stacey Abrams was an author. Actually, now when I looked her up, she's written several books under a pen name, Selena Montgomery. So she's not new to this. She's done it for a while, Of course, we're based out of Georgia here, so we know Stacey Abrams, as Isaiah mentioned, from her governor's candidacy in 2018. She's now running again in 2022 for the governor election. So I primarily knew about Stacey from that perspective. But as you guys mentioned, the book is very detailed. I kind of nerded out, man. Your boy kind of techie, so I was over here taking notes. I was like, okay. Like, oh, this character did this. Like, so I was kind of nerding out with all the details. Kim kind of mentioned it. So if you guys love like Scandal, How to Get Away with Murder, House of Cards, like this is right up the alley. Like she got to be related to like Shonda Rhimes or something, because like she was writing almost to that same level of detail. This murder mystery, twists and turns. I mean, people getting killed. Had a little romance involved as well. It was a lot going on, but I really enjoyed the book. I like the fact that she used a lot of accurate and like real world scenarios. Like to a certain degree, I can see a lot of this stuff happening in real life. And I was really just kind of shocked and surprised that again, Stacey Abrams, I knew as a candidate for governor, was writing this book, and it was very well written, and just a good read. So I was impressed. I enjoyed it. I usually don't like fiction books, but this was a good one. Kind of reminds me of like a John Grisham novel or something along those lines as well. So good read from my perspective as well.
You've obviously written in several different genres, which is admirable and incredibly impressive. You've written a number of nonfiction books about politics. This is your first, what we might think of as a genuine thriller. And then you've written as Selena Montgomery a number of books as romance in the romance genre. And what we were talking about is that, obviously there's a difference between the language you use for political nonfiction and then fiction, but what word choices do you make that are peculiar to thriller? Did you consciously adjust your language when shifting from romance to thriller?
So I write romantic suspense, and in that space, because I write more suspense driven than purely romance driven, that's given me more flexibility with the language I use. In romance, you are doing a lot more character development in a very specific way. You are building a relational profile. And so a lot of the language you use is really designed to allow the reader to believe that they either know the characters really well, or if you're really good at it, they feel like they are the characters.
Right.
In While Justice Sleeps and in sort of traditional thriller, sometimes the language is a distancing technique. because you've got to create these multiple universes that are operating both in tandem and in tension. And so my challenge there was really to have characters who were so distinct and have universes that worked together, but again, in this sort of tension that the language really had to think about, okay, if I'm talking to lawyers, what will lawyers sound like? If I'm talking to politicians, what do they sound like? If I'm talking to a biogeneticist, what does that universe sound like? But making sure that you could, if you closed your eyes, you could, and you heard the dialogue, you would know distinct characters from one another. And so I guess the through line is, I love language. And even in my romance novels, I have a tendency to use the most complicated language I can without going over, because I love words. And I think books, especially genre fiction, is genre writing is an amazing place to try new words out, as long as you provide good context. And so that was a very complicated way of saying, yeah, sort of.
I was really impressed by how faithful to the conventions of this genre you were, except there was one section, it was on page 338, and this is not really a spoiler, but your protagonist, the heroine, ends up in the judge's chambers with the judge's son, and there's been some romantic tension between them, but not so much. It's not driving the book. And then suddenly they kiss, and you have this line, the kiss stretched beyond time, comma, beyond promise. And I have to say, I felt like you were really doing a romance writer flex there. Like it was such a beautiful line. It's very short, but it's a very poetic use of promise, beyond promise. And it felt like you were just showing that you can kind of switch over into this slightly other alternate dimension there.
Well, so I started writing this book 10 years ago, and I had different friends read it. I don't write my book to my readers in the sense that I'm not going to have someone say, oh, I don't like this, and I'm going to change a bunch of things. But readers find different things in stories that you didn't know you were doing. I was very thoughtful about not making this a romance novel. And while there are certainly the romantic capacity or possibilities existed in the story, I did think I was doing a disservice not to acknowledge it, but I wasn't going to make it the whole story. And so sometimes a single line or a couple of lines give you everything that the reader who wanted to see resolution, it gives them the thing they need without it becoming a whole chapter. And so that was my flex.
I guess the effect that you're trying to have on the reader between romance and mystery, it kind of feels like it's sort of the same muscle. You're kind of constantly keeping people on the edge of their seat, it feels like.
I want readers to want to stay in the world I create. And both through form and language, that's the way you hold them. So, the format is that you want to create a story that, and I completely recognize that I'm ripping off Aristotle, but essentially you want to create a problem that by resolution creates a new problem, so that the reader constantly has to stay with the story to find out what else is going to occur. And that's, a nice little cheat to draw them through it. So the form requires it. And then the language requires it. If you get bored with the word choice, even if you care about the story, you're going to put it down. You might come back, you may not. And so for me, whether it's fiction and within fiction, whether it's romance or, I've written a serial killer romance novel, I've written action adventure one, I've written this legal thriller. The language for me is always, I want people to like the writing. I want them to like the words, and I want them to feel smarter, not in a pedantic way or didactic way, but in a, I now know something new, or I've now gotten something else I hadn't expected by traveling through this book, and I want to stay and see what else I can get.
Yeah, I felt through the entire book just a sense of a respect for the audience. Like you respected your reader enough to know that, you could go off on, tangents about scientific and legal things that they might not necessarily understand, but you know that they will catch up. You know that they will be there with you.
You use language, you don't dumb it down, but you contextualize it, and you contextualize the ideas and the conceits and the objectives in a way that everyone can be a part of it. And so you don't, I always resist the sort of lowest common denominator theory of writing. Like, trust that people will meet you where you are, and if they're not there on their own, give them a map so they can meet you there.
And at certain points, you have characters talking about these agencies or initialisms, and you don't need to explain what it is, because it would, to my line of thinking, it would slow down the narrative. And other points, you do make it clear where it seems germane or appropriate. And it was nice to feel like, as a reader, you didn't need to hold our hands the whole way. And so it was very refreshing.
Well, thank you. I mean, as someone who has worked in government and more specifically as a bureaucrat, I think there's a necessity to be authentic in how those conversations would happen. So when it's Betty Papaleo, like, of course, she's going to talk about things in acronyms because that's how she thinks, that's how she works. Right. But when it's, when it's either new to the characters or when the reader doesn't need to know, if the reader doesn't need to know it, it doesn't need to be in the story. But I'm always trying to make sure that the language you're going to need to understand later on, give it to you early enough so that when I reference it again, it doesn't feel brand new. Right. And I may not explain it the first time I say it, but I want to just lay the breadcrumbs or at least give you the baseline so that when this new idea comes into being and actually matters at this moment, that you don't feel jarred and shoved into this world that you weren't expecting to be in. Because right. I find, especially in genre fiction, when either the writer wants you to be there with him or her already, they'll dump you in and you sometimes feel like you're drowning in new information without having either life preserver or learning to swim, or they think you're so shallow, they make it so shallow that anybody could be there and it doesn't really give you the texture of where you want to be. And so my goal is always to calibrate it so that, I may dump you in there, but I've at least told you that, how deep the water is, or I've given you a life preserver to get you through.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was the language that you gave to Judge Wynn was really kind of very characteristic. And I was wondering, it was a great line: jurisprudence is one of the last pure métiers of Western civilization, like the blues are bid whist. And I felt like that was such indicative of so much of its character. Because, we all know, we've often heard of, the only American contributions to art are jazz or blues and spaghetti westerns, but I was unfamiliar with bid whist as one of the things that we've contributed to Western civilization. And it really made me wonder if this was based on a character that you knew, and if because his vocal stylings, his conversation was very, very peculiar. And I mean peculiar in the sense it was indicative of his individual character. And it made me wonder if you are basing either the character or the way he speaks on another person, a real person.
Not exactly on another person, but a composite of people who I could see melding into him. One of the approaches I take when I talk about race in books is that I don't actually ascribe a race to a character, because when I was growing up reading, too often the only characters who were ever mentioned by their race were characters of color. Everyone else was assumed to be white. And so part of my approach has been to add the sort of cultural, the cultural pieces through other means. And bid whist is, in the Black community, bid whist and spades are two games that are just considered, if you can play those games, then you are invited to the cookout, you are a part of community. And so for me, I wanted him to be very much of to be this curmudgeon and to be this man who just was obnoxious, but so cleverly obnoxious that you could get mad, but you wouldn't walk away. But the bid whist piece for me was important because it was a cultural nod without necessarily having to be overt. If you got it, you got it. And if you didn't, you missed nothing in the story.
That is such a great cultural nod. It's so subtle but so telling. So that was a lovely detail.
So I've been killing people in books for a very long time, and you've got to calibrate gore with the impact of the death. If I believe in a good body count that is that's meaningful for the story. So my serial killer romance novel, I made sure there was a really healthy body count. But if it's more a traditional thriller, you want the body count to make sense. Like if this guy is going around killing all of these people, someone's going to notice. So if you've got to have a limited body count, then you need to make every death make sense, and every death should shock and should make you worry about the next person that he encounters. And so that was also part of the goal to, and you want different kinds of death. And yeah, everybody gets shot all the time. So what can you do to make the death more fun this time?
The question that a lot of people seem to have regarding this book, and I have as well, is do you play chess?
Yes.
Yes.
So I taught myself to play chess when I was in high school by checking out a bunch of books and getting my mom and dad to buy me a chess set. I did not play with anyone else, so I taught my youngest brother, Walter, to play chess. And so I'm not a great chess player, but I know a lot about the history of chess because I learned to play chess by reading history and reading books about famous chess matches. And that's how I learned to play chess.
Uh-huh. And so that's where the Lasker Bauer comes from, right?
And Lawrence wants to know, who are your favorite writers? Fiction, biography, political commentary?
I will give an array of writers because I do not pick favorites because they change. And there are some I will go back to. Nora Roberts will always be one of the premier romance novelists because she has mastered the art of genre fiction in just exceptional ways, both her traditional romance as well as her writing as J.D. Robb, which is sort of criminal, romantic thriller. She meshes genres there. Robert Caro is the preeminent biographer for me, although I do adore books by, I like Doris Kearns Goodwin. I think everything David Halberstam has written, and Taylor Branch. So I think they're really solid writers who tell extraordinary stories that are real and true. In science fiction, N.K. Jemisin has become a writer I really love to read. And in this sort of floating world of science fiction, science-ish, Rebecca Roanhorse has been really, really fun to read. And then, traditional writers, the canon writers, Charles Dickens cannot be beaten. That's someone who really appreciated language. Yes, because he was paid by the word, but he made certain that everyone he used made sense. I love writing, but when I am writing to a major project, I wrote my first book, Rules of Engagement, on spec. So I wrote it, sent it out in the world, they bought it. After that, I was on a contract for every other book I wrote. And I was also practicing law or starting a business, or I was in the legislature. So I've always had to make sure I wrote while I was doing other things. So I'm not a wake up at 6 a.m. and write. I'm more a, let me find how many days it's going to take me to write this book. And then I carve out that number of days and that number of hours to get it done. I do a synopsis for myself. So usually I'll write a scene so I know where I'm going and who my main characters are. I then do a story. I do a synopsis, then I do a storyboard, and then I plot out the book chapter to chapter. And once that's done, I just have to get it written because either they want a book or they want their money back. And usually the money is gone. And so the book has to manifest itself. And thank you to all the wordsmith out there and word lovers.